Veterans Day. A popular holiday in the United States, a 3-day weekend in November right before Thanksgiving, is actually a holiday that goes beyond just America. Known as Remembrance Day in the UK and throughout Europe, it was originally called Armistice Day and has been widely applied, especially in the United States, to celebrate veterans of all wars, both living and dead, both past and present. Veterans Day honors all who served, but it was actually a holiday celebrated beginning in 1919 following World War I and was only supposed to be about World War I. Celebrating the victory at such great cost of the first modern war, the war to end all wars, found its origin not just in the United States, but in Great Britain, where in 1919 a grave was marked for the unknown soldier, representative of the millions who lost their lives in World War I. A much more solemn and morose holiday in the UK and throughout most of Europe than it is in the United States, where it is one of celebration and the celebration of the veterans. It commemorates the day when World War I ended, with the armistice when the Germans, the last major power fighting the Allies, surrendered. The war ended in 1918, but would have long-lasting consequences. Of course, the Paris Peace Agreements and the Treaty of Versailles in the following years would lead to great changes in European history, as Germany would take the heavy brunt, the blame, the punishment, and the war indemnity for what was the most brutal war in human history. The technology of the Industrial Revolution was now being used to destroy lives, and destroy lives it had. The United States, where the celebration is most well known, was a relative newcomer to the war when it joined in 1917. The war had already been raging for 3 years with many different fronts all throughout the different parts of the world, the Middle East, Africa, but especially the western and eastern parts of Europe. The United States joined because of the unrestricted German submarine warfare that had led to the sinking of the Lusitania, as well as Germany's promise to Mexico to invade the United States. The United States would bring fresh boots on the ground and refresh a western front that was devastated by the continual warfare between the Germans, French, British, and their allies. It had all started a few years before this, and no one had anticipated that it would become what it eventually was. The assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife in Sarajevo in 1914 in Bosnia by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, had cast a giant dark shadow of the summer of 1914 that had loomed large in the last 4 years. Austria wanted revenge. Franz Joseph I, Europe's longest reigning monarch, demanded such things. And with the aid of the Germans, and with the French and Russians coming to the aid of the Serbians, and with families coming to war, the two sides were drawn together. The European emperors, such as George V of the Great British and Nicholas II, as well as Kaiser Wilhelm II and Franz Joseph, were all related to each other. The grandchildren and relatives of Queen Victoria, the great British monarch, were all now clashing in an air of supremacy, as their technology was going to be used to destroy as many lives as possible and devastate Europe for decades to come. With the Germans and the Austrians joined by the Ottomans and the Bulgarians, the war seemed to gain more and more land and more sizes as empires joined in total. The Germans' plan of knocking the French out had led to them invading Belgium, which had joined Britain into the war and eventually led to trench warfare. The failed Schlieffen Plan had eventually led to the continuation, as empires all around the world, such as the British, the French, the Russians, and the Germans, fought in places like Africa and the Middle East. These empires would be forever changed, such as the Russians, who dropped out of the war in 1917 due to the revolution, which would lead to the rise of communism under Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But again, utilizing the technology of Industrial Revolution, the European superpowers used this to destroy each other at great cost to each other. With trench warfare, mustard gas, barbed wire, the earliest primitive tanks, U-boats, and plane warfare, the war was a disaster. In the United States, President Wilson tried to keep the United States from joining the war. However, continued pressure eventually led them to join. With planes, tanks, zeppelins, submarines, and all other technology, life was deemed quickly over throughout most of the war, especially in the Western Front, where trench warfare was devastatingly horrible. But the United States joining the conflict allowed the Western allies to gain much-needed support. This allowed them, along with the propaganda that they portrayed, to overwhelm the Germans and eventually corner them. With Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Bulgaria, and the Ottomans starving, they eventually surrendered, leading to the victory, leading to Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. The German surrender would lead to great repercussions as the Europeans, with the protestations of Woodrow Wilson available, vowed to punish the Germans for causing the war. Although it had been the play of all the European empires trying to be as powerful as possible, the Germans would receive much of the blame, which would cause later problems later on. The Paris Peace Accords did indeed punish the enemies, especially the Treaty of Versailles, which made Germany the main culprit of World War I. However, these treaties would lead to the formation of a state that would cause World War II later on. However, the celebrations would continue as the Americans triumphed in their glory while the British and French remembered their fallen. Eventually, the celebration of Armistice Day would become known as Veterans Day in the United States, with it becoming a national holiday in 1938 and being renamed to celebrate veterans of all wars in 1956 as a holiday that usually should have involved the entire world came to be a representative of America's many, many wars.